This is the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, one of the most feared and controversial criminals in the history of Brazil. Some people called him a vigilante, others called him a monster. But his life was filled with violence from the very beginning, and most of his life was spent inside prison. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born in 1954 in a small town in Brazil. His childhood was not normal. He grew up in a violent environment, and his family life was very troubled. His father was known to be abusive, and Pedro witnessed violence from a very young age. Many experts believe that his childhood played a big role in shaping the person he later became. From a young age, Pedro had a very short temper and often got into fights. He later said in interviews that he always felt anger inside him and that he hated people who he believed were doing wrong things. This way of thinking slowly became more and more dangerous as he grew older. When Pedro was still a teenager, his father lost his job after being accused of stealing from the place where he worked. Pedro believed that a local politician was responsible for this. Filled with anger and a desire for revenge, Pedro decided to take matters into his own hands. This led to his first murder when he was still very young. Later, he found out that the person he killed was not actually responsible. When he discovered who he believed was the real person behind his father's firing, he killed that person too. By the time he was 18 years old, Pedro had already committed multiple murders. As the years went on, Pedro Rodrigues Filho continued killing. But unlike many serial killers, he claimed that he only targeted criminals, people he believed were murderers, rapists, or gang members. Because of this, some people in Brazil started calling him a vigilante, someone who was punishing criminals when the law could not. But the truth is that Pedro was still a criminal himself. He believed he had the right to decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die, and that made him extremely dangerous. Eventually, Pedro was arrested and sent to prison. But prison did not stop the violence. In fact, prison became the place where he became even more infamous. Inside prison, Pedro Rodrigues Filho killed many other inmates. He said that he targeted people who had committed terrible crimes. Prison authorities considered him one of the most dangerous prisoners in the country because even behind bars, he continued to kill. He spent decades moving from one prison to another. During this time, psychologists, criminologists, and journalists interviewed him many times. They tried to understand how someone could live a life like his and show so little regret. Pedro often said that he did not feel sorry for his victims because he believed they were bad people. This way of thinking shocked many experts and made his case very famous in criminology and psychology studies. Brazil has a law that limits the maximum number of years a person can spend in prison, even if they have committed many serious crimes. Because of this law, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was eventually released from prison in 2007 after spending many years behind bars. After his release, something very unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing and living a quiet life, Pedro began giving interviews. He talked openly about his crimes, his life in prison, and the mistakes he had made. Later, he even appeared on YouTube, where he spoke about crime and warned young people not to follow the same path he did. He told people that violence only leads to destruction and that a life of crime always ends badly. Some people believed that he had changed. Others believed that he was still a dangerous man. Because of his past, he had made many enemies over the years, both inside and outside prison. Many people believed that his story would not have a peaceful ending. In 2023, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was killed in Brazil. With his death, the story of one of the most violent and controversial criminals in modern Brazilian history finally came to an end. The story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho is still discussed today in criminology and psychology. His life raises many difficult questions. Was he a vigilante, or was he just a serial killer who tried to justify his actions? Can a person who lived such a violent life really change? And how much does childhood and environment affect what a person becomes later in life? One thing is certain. The life of Pedro Rodrigues Filho was a story of violence, revenge, prison, and consequences. It is a story that shows how anger and hatred can slowly destroy a person's life and the lives of many others. This was the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a man whose life became one of the most shocking criminal stories in the history of Brazil.